This was a major revolution, really, in ship design, of which the Mary Rose was the sort of very beginning.
By the mid-16th century, England's march toward naval dominance was in full flow. But Henry soon ran into a problem. The cost of arming his ships with expensive bronze guns was quickly draining England's treasure chest.
He's got to find other ways to produce the kinds of, heavy artillery which can help his armies and his navy fight effectively, but at a lower cost. And the cast iron gun is the perfect solution. The cast iron gun runs less than a fifth of the cost of a bronze one.
A successful cast iron cannon had never been made before, but Henry knew how to make it happen. He turned to the country's famous iron-making region, the Weald, and gave his engineers a mandate.
The difficulty with casting in iron a large piece like a cannon was the fact that, for a start, iron had to be melted at a much higher temperature.
There was only one way to get the temperatures high enough, an engineering wonder of the time, the blast furnace. First, workers poured wood and iron ore into the top of a 20-foot tall stone furnace. A water wheel powered a large bellows that pumped air into the fire, stoking it until it reached an incredible 2,200 degrees, hot enough to melt the iron. Workers then opened a tap at the base of the furnace. A stream of hot molten iron poured down a trough and filled a cannon mold buried deep in the ground.
It was a very big undertaking, and it was very pressured as well. You had, of course, charcoal burners who produced the charcoal in the woods around the furnace. You had labourers who dug the iron ore from pits in the ground. You had teams of labourers bringing wagon loads of ore and charcoal to the furnace.
Over the next few centuries, the Weald's iron cannons became the envy and dread of every other European ruler.
The transformation is tremendous. It gave England power and a technological edge that no other European power could match.
In just 30 years, Henry had built his navy into a powerhouse, but he would never live to see his ultimate dream of European conquest. Enormously obese, his oversized appetites finally betrayed him. He died in January 1547, leaving a legacy of brutality and innovation that stands through the ages. His reign had laid the seeds that would explode into a mighty empire.
And Henry lays the foundations all right by building a navy, by building this notion of Britain as forming an empire, an imperial presence in the world.
Backed by the growing power of their navy, England's empire would expand over the next 150 years through colonization and conquest. By the mid-18th century, Britain controlled parts of India, Africa, the West Indies, and North America. But two major threats to the burgeoning empire loomed ahead, and the king who would fight them, George III, would also be battling demons of his own.
It's always talked about as his madness. It was a physical illness that he had, but the effect was that it affected his brain.
George first slipped into madness in 1788, 7 years after suffering a withering blow. A small territory a world away had defeated the mighty British in a war of independence. It was called America.
When the British troops leave Yorktown, when they surrender, they play this tune, "The World Turned Upside Down." And that is really how it seems. The world has turned upside down. The world's gone mad. When rebels win.
Over the next decade, George's world slowly caved in on him. Then in 1804, another threat would send the king and his empire spiraling to the brink. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. By the early 1800s, the tyrannical conqueror was quickly overtaking Europe. England was his last obstacle to continental dominance.
He was as large a threat as the Nazis were in the Second World War. He was amassing the forces for an invasion of the British Isles.
England's Royal Navy had become a major force at sea, and in 1805, it faced Napoleon's invasion threat head-on in the momentous Battle of Trafalgar. Using fearless naval tactics and the most technically advanced ships of the age, England annihilated the combined forces of the French and Spanish fleets.
Trafalgar confirms Britain's position as the supreme maritime power, and the British emerge as the unsurpassed masters of those naval technologies.
But by the time of Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, King George III was permanently gripped by insanity, becoming a mere figurehead of power.
His mind is completely gone. His eyesight goes as well, and he wanders up and down the corridors of Windsor Castle, has to be fed like a baby. Long beard, long hair, no idea what day it is. It's just very sad.
By this time, England was growing rapidly into a superpower, based on the supremacy of its naval engineering. But it would be another realm of technical superiority that would catapult the British Empire to global dominance. The 19th century was about to usher in a period of engineering invention not seen since the Romans. The Mary Rose sank in a battle with the French in 1545. In 1982, the ship was raised from the bottom of the sea. By the 19th century, Britain had developed into an industrial titan, bursting with wealth. Its monumental success came from a period of staggering technological invention that swept across the empire and then dominated the globe.
It's hard to think of a period in history where you had so much creativity in terms of technology, so much willing to experiment with the possibilities of what you can do with machines, what you can do with engineering, what you can do with architecture.
In the past, empires had been built by hand. Now the British would dominate their territory with machines.
Engineering innovations like cast iron and the turning of a warship into a single ballistic offensive entity with guns transformed the English Navy. And that Navy transformed England into an empire. And that military and commercial empire that spread from Europe to Asia, from the Americas to Africa, dominated the seas. But what about the land? Because by the early 1800s, Britain was jumping with productivity, but lacking in means of overland distribution. Well, in 1782, a man named James Watt perfected an engine driven by steam. But it was 40 years later that George Stephenson and his son Robert took that engine and with a firebox, boiler, piston, and a remarkable invention called the chimney, powered a locomotive called the rocket over tracks at the blistering speed of 29 miles an hour and revolutionized overland commercial transportation with the railroad.
The rocket was not the first locomotive, but its unique engineering features proved that steam trains were the force of the future. The key to its speed was in its engine. A series of copper pipes carried hot gases from a coal-fueled firebox through a chamber of water, bringing it to a boil. This created steam that rose up into a dome and was forced through a valve into a cylinder. The intense pressure from the steam pushed a piston rod that connected to the wheels of the locomotive, powering it forward. By venting the exhaust steam out of a chimney instead of the cylinder, fresh air was sucked into the firebox, stoking the fire. With this advance, the rocket could charge ahead at blazing speeds.
Of all the locomotives that were imagined at the time, it's the one that looks the most like a locomotive will. I mean, it's going to be improved in innumerable ways, but that basic machine is the one that emerges as a locomotive for the next century.
The race was on to build railroads across Britain. And in 1833, a brilliant and brash engineer rose to prominence when he entered the railroad game. His name was Isambard Kingdom Brunel.
Brunel was a real showman. He dressed well, he had a beautiful wife. He was a celebrity, and he knew how to play that to a hilt. He was also a workaholic. He had a very difficult time delegating.
Brunel had a bold vision for his railway. It would be the most ambitious project to date, a massive network of railroads connecting all of England together. He called it the Great Western Railway, and he was determined to make it the fastest line ever created.
He wanted a track which was on a very, very shallow gradient so that the trains would be able to travel that much faster.
The need for speed meant going through mountains rather than over them, and this led to his greatest engineering marvel. Today, it is known as the Box Tunnel.
It was necessary, essentially, to chisel through rock, and the length of the tunnel was something like 1 3/4 miles, which was really astonishing for this time. That's a really serious tunnel, even by today's standards.
Brunel amassed hundreds of Irish workers called navvies to dig the tunnel. They began by sinking a series of shafts from the top of the hill. Gunpowder was used to blast through the rock. Then the navvies were lowered in baskets down the shaft, where they excavated the materials with basic hand tools. Horses turned winches that pulled the material to the top of the hill.
It was a slow, painful, and sometimes quite a dangerous process, of course. And there were fatalities on the Box Tunnel during its construction. Lots of dust, lots of grime, and when the explosions were going off, the risk of flying rock.
After 4 years of work that claimed more than 100 lives, the Box Tunnel was finished. The Great Western Railway finally opened in 1841. Trains still run through the Box Tunnel to this day. The railway mania that Brunel helped ignite eventually spread to the rest of the empire, tightening England's stranglehold on power around the world.
Railways in the middle of the 19th century, first in England and then wherever they spread, they're sources of just incredible wonder. They're big, they're loud, they're dirty, and they're just power. And they represent speed, they represent the conquest of space and time. They're literally awesome machines.
With the runaway success of the railway, Britain was now decades ahead of the rest of the world in modern engineering technology. Their empire was fast approaching its apex. But a staggering blow to its nerve center would rattle the empire to its very foundations. The first person to be killed by a train was a member of Parliament. He was struck by the rocket in 1830. October 1834. In the dark of the London night, a violent fire rages through the very heart of the British Empire, Westminster Palace. For centuries, this complex of buildings had been the command center of British power and a towering symbol of its strength. Now, as flames turn the palace into a roaring inferno, thousands watch in shock and horror, wondering what will become of their mighty government.
The fire of 1834 had dealt a devastating blow to the political nerve center of the British Empire. Westminster Palace had stood in some form or another since the late 11th century during the time of William the Conqueror. And now these ruins had the British people wondering, would Parliament ever meet again in this place? Would Parliament ever rise and vote again in these magnificent buildings that had given birth to the modern political process? Well, a royal commission was appointed to decide this very thing, and the royal commission decided, yes, Parliament would be reconstructed in this place. But now a more difficult question came up. What would these buildings look like? Would they be neo-Gothic, French, Italian, or English? Or would they be the perpendicular style of Elizabethan Tudor or English Renaissance? A sort of a civic war happened for 2 years until 1836. The Royal Commission, over 97 proposals, chose the plan of a man named Charles Barry, who was a fan of the Italian Renaissance, but he combined those elements with neo-Gothic, and he gave us this. the Houses of Parliament we have today, a sort of a mishmash of styles, but a stunning mishmash nonetheless.
From the ruins of the old Parliament, British architects would design a government building of staggering proportions, twice the size of the U.S. Capitol. Constructed of sand-colored limestone called Anston, the palace would take up 8 acres of land, with towers soaring as much as 320 feet into the sky. It was decided that one of these massive structures would be a grand clock tower. Today, we know it as Big Ben.
You're able to measure time much more accurately in the 19th century, and time is important. Time comes to mean money, and there's something of a revolution in the 19th century about timekeeping. So if you're going to have this latest building, yeah, a clock tower goes on it.
When the royal astronomer George Airy announced his requirements for the clock, people were stunned. It would be the largest and most ambitious timepiece the world had ever seen.
Now, Airy's demands for excellence were fairly rigorous. For instance, one of his requirements was that the clock be accurate to within 1 second every 24-hour period, and furthermore, that the accuracy reports of this clock be telegraphed on down the River Thames to the Greenwich Observatory twice a day. Now, this was not the 21st century age of information. A digital clockmaker today, this would not be shooting for the moon, but a 19th century clockmaker, to make such a great clock in a huge tower with such heavy striking mechanisms, pushing such heavy hands, with such precision and such accuracy that would be exposed to the rain, wind, and elements second after second, hour after hour, week after week, year after year. This was absolutely unimaginable. It was like going to the moon. So Parliament, rightfully, asked Airy if he might come up with a plan that was a little bit more reasonable, a little less expensive. But Airy was adamant. And thus the clock today we call Big Ben, which is really the name of the bell, became the standard for timekeeping the world over.
Incredibly, it was an amateur clockmaker by the name of Edmund Beckett Denison who designed the famous clock when all other experts failed to meet the challenge of pinpoint accuracy. Like all clocks of this type, Denison's would be powered by weights, gears, and a pendulum. But Big Ben's design featured a groundbreaking new device that would protect the pendulum from outside forces. 2 metal arms control a wheel with 3 spokes. With each swing of the pendulum, one of the arms opens, allowing the wheel to turn a notch. This regulates the movement of the clock. When rain or snow weighs down the clock's hands, the arms isolate the pendulum so it keeps swinging without being affected. To fine-tune the clock's accuracy, timekeepers simply reach into their own pockets.
Pennies are used as part of its regulating its accuracy. By adding or taking away one of these old pennies from the pendulum, the clock can actually gain or lose 2/5 of a second in 24 hours.
With this brilliant but simple method, the clock became world famous as a marvel of precision engineering.
The clock tower over the Parliament at the centre of the empire has a peculiarly powerful symbolic importance. It's as if time itself is governed by the British.
In addition to the clock, a series of bells was needed to toll the passing time, with an enormous central bell ringing on the hour. A bell founder by the name of George Mears cast the giant bell to Denison's precise specifications, and Big Ben was born, weighing a staggering 13 tons. Huge crowds lined the streets of London and cheered as Big Ben was transported to the finished clock tower in 1858. It has been filling London with its distinctive rings ever since.
London grew as a city tremendously. It was really the first large-scale conurbation in the world. And as a city, it had to have its icons, and the ultimate icon being the mother of parliaments, the parliamentary building with Big Ben as a symbol of the strength and the power of the British Empire.
By the mid-19th century, Great Britain had set the gold standard for technological achievement. But under the reign of a young, naive queen, a crisis would strike London and push it to the brink of disaster. A flock of birds landed on the minute hand of Big Ben in 1949 and set the time back 5 minutes. In 1837, a teenage girl takes the reins of the most powerful empire on earth. Her rise to power ignites turmoil throughout Great Britain. Both her subjects and her government view her as spoiled, impetuous, and unprepared to rule. Her name was Queen Victoria.
She was only 18 when she came to the throne, and she'd had a very, very difficult first couple of years on the throne, and in fact was very unpopular.
There was little to indicate this immature girl would grow up to become a revered symbol of the empire's immense power. Her transformation started when she married her cousin Albert in 1840.
She fell in love almost at first sight. All her life, actually, she wants someone to lean on, metaphorically and indeed literally. And Albert is able to take her in hand, rather. So he comes in and he helps her grow up.
By this time, the empire stretched around the world, from North America to Australia. Albert and Victoria pushed for greatness in engineering and technology, knowing how crucial these advances were to their expanding empire. None more so than the emerging technology of the telegraph.
You've got an empire which has